Hey guys, it's your boy, Boston Bookhead. Today, we're gonna be talking about pirates, one of my favorite topics. So pirates come from all around the world, different time periods, various backgrounds, but the ones I'm gonna be talking about today are Atlantic pirates, specifically pirates during the golden age of piracy, the early 1700s. A quick little background: War of Spanish Succession left England, France, and Spain economically broke, so that meant most of their navies had to get rid of pretty much everyone who sailed underneath of them. According to Marcus Rediker, author of Villains of All Nations, Piracy During the Golden Age, Britain had the biggest downsides. They went from about 50,000 sailors in 1712 down to about 13,000 not even 2 years later. So because of that, a lot of ex-sailors took to piracy since they were no longer being employed. Now, today when we think about pirates, we think about a lot of crude, dirty, buccaneer type men. But not all of them are like this. Nah, the ones I'm talking about are going to be the gentleman pirates, and they are arguably the most important type of pirates out there. But Adam, you can't be a pirate and a gentleman. You can't plunder and be a gentleman. You can't have stinky feet and be a gentleman. Yeah, maybe you're right, but let's take a second to historicize masculinity. I'll be talking mainly about England, since they produced about 50% of the pirates during the golden age of piracy, and I want to start by taking a look at the Glorious Revolution of 1689. Pretty much what happened was all the poor people were like, hey, this monarchy has too much power. Let's throw a riot. And they threw many, 2 years worth of riots. And what happened was King James II ultimately got ousted, and he was replaced by his Protestant daughter Mary and her husband William of Orange, who was Dutch. So this did a whole slew of things. For one, it gave Parliament a lot more power, setting the structure for political democracy. Now, with political democracy, that took a lot of importance out of being royal and delegitimized the aristocratic ideology. So now, wealth didn't necessarily equal status alone. This new political settlement allowed masculinity to come in and change to a kind of system where the individual earned status through self-cultivation, self-motivation, upholding social manners, and really taking what he needs by the balls. But Adam, what about all the people with the big houses? We don't need them. So by the early 1700s, the modern man no longer bowed down to the rich. In fact, he created his own authority. This is when masculinity was starting to be defined by self-authorization and social legitimacy, or how you use your manners. I also want to note, on a literary standpoint, the gentleman pirate is a lot like the trickster hero. By altering the ground of authority's legitimacy, the gentleman pirate is able to not only manipulate situations to his advantage, but to also navigate the world using his mental prowess. Gary Hoppenstand, professor at Michigan State University, wrote in his foreword to Raphael Sabatini's book Captain Blood that the function of the trickster in popular fiction is twofold. At one level, this hero has appealed to the early 20th century working class reader, one of the major audiences of popular fiction, since the trickster is often a rebel figure who thwarts the unscrupulous might of those in power. And historically, this was the objective of many pirates, both to take revenge on the government that had ousted them and treated them like poo-poo caca when they were employed. So let's take a look at a few pirates. I want to start with the gentleman pirate, Stede Bonnet, who actually had the title of the gentleman pirate. So I love Stede Bonnet. He's a freaking madman. Bonnet had made his way to a major in the Barbados militia. He had plenty of land, he had plenty of wealth, and he married a woman named Mary Lambie. Specifics of where he received his education growing up are not super well known, but Judge Nicholas Trott referred heavily to his liberal education at his sentencing. So my favorite thing about Stede Bonnet is that it wasn't that he was out for revenge from the government or anything like that. No. Scholars believe that his nagging wife and mental instability had led him away from home and into a life of piracy. Stede Bonnet later became famous for working a lot with Blackbeard, but he had a very short, about a year, 2-year run as a pirate and was betrayed, backstabbed by Blackbeard, and ultimately sentenced to hang. But I will stick with the theory. So Bonnet was a self-cultivating man. He was running from his wife. He felt like his old life, most likely, was getting a little too boring or just annoying for him, and because of that, he took up piracy. But of course, because this was a real man and we don't have a lot of facts, I can't really go beyond that. So let's go to the books. Perhaps not one of the earliest gentleman pirates in literature, but definitely one of the earliest in modern pop culture is Captain Peter Blood from Raphael Sabatini's book Captain Blood. Peter Blood is an Irish physician who's an ex-soldier, and he's sold into slavery and makes friends with all his slave buddies, and they break out and they start a crew and become one of the most feared crews in the Caribbean. But throughout the story, Peter is committed to maintaining his moral code and staying a healer, not a fighter. He was a man of medicine and not of war. A healer, not a slayer. Blood is guided by codes of polite civility and restraint, and we often see him try to use his head before he uses bronze. At the beginning, Blood wants nothing to do with the revolution that's going on. This is that glorious revolution. But eventually, after he gets sold into slavery, his feelings towards King James change a little bit. Throwback to my boy Gary Hoppenstand, who writes, Sabatini well understood the value and role of the trickster hero, and he employed his character to great effect as an agent of political change in his stories. Peter Blood's rise to power is emblematic of the American middle-class myth of success. It is also emblematic of the British love of social grace displayed under the most difficult of circumstances. By his actions, Blood demonstrates that nobility is innate. So with Peter Blood representing a lot of the social change for both Americans who believe in the American dream and the British who really value their manners, when Peter succeeds, the beliefs succeed. And that's what's really interesting about gentlemen pirates, is that they are educated and they do reflect both the vice and values of masculinity in society at that time. And throughout the novel, Blood is kind of serving as an underdog. He always finds himself in these impossible situations, but uses his brains and his love of people, really, that sounds so cheesy, to get out of them. The important thing to remember is that Peter Blood is a man of self-virtue, but his self-virtue often coincides with what's going on politically in the world. At one point he states, "Justice is the concern of every loyal subject. For an injustice committed by one who holds the king's commission is in some sense a dishonor to the king's majesty." So with the combination between his education as a learned man, as a physician, his motivation to preserve human life, and his need for self-cultivation, Peter Blood is the perfect example of a gentleman pirate, and he's smooth as hell. Another example is J.M. Barrie's Captain Hook. Barrie notes that he was never more sinister than when he was polite, which is probably the truest test of breeding. At the elegance of his diction, even when he was swearing, no less than the distinction of his demeanor, showed him one of a different cast from his crew. Just like Peter Blood, albeit a little bit more unhinged, James Hook is always putting his social graces first. In his case, he refers to them as good form, or a code of conduct that prioritizes dignity, respect, and pride above all else. And this is because, as many people might not know, he went to Eton, one of the most prestigious private schools to ever exist in England. And though it's not specifically said in the book, J.M. Barrie does allude to Hook as a pop, which is a member of one of the most elite social clubs at Eton. Though in the 1928 play, Hook's dying words are Floreat Etona, or May Eton Flourish, the school's motto. Barrie writes, "He had been at a famous public school, and its traditions still clung to him like garments, with which indeed they are largely concerned. Above all, he retained the passion for good form." Now, one example, and a very malicious example at that, when he is the ultimate gentleman-like pirate and uses it in a very terrifying way, is when he's capturing the Darlings and the Lost Boys. Barrie writes that a different treatment was accorded to Wendy, who came last. With ironical politeness, Hook raised his hat to her, and offering her his arm, escorted her to the spot where the others were being gagged. He did it with such an air, he was so frightfully distinct, that she was too fascinated to cry out. And though, again, it's very malicious, he's definitely embodying a gentleman pirate. He's being very charming, using his masculinity to put Wendy in a false sense of comfort, and ultimately self-cultivating for his own needs. And the last pirate I'm going to talk about is James Norrington from the Pirates of the Caribbean series. In the first movie, we see James Norrington, who is completely dedicated to being a British naval officer. In fact, he's even promoted to Commodore after helping establish Port Royal as a British colony. But in the second movie, he's a big old drunk. After pursuing Jack Sparrow and losing his crew and his ship, he he is yoinked right out of the Navy. Disgraced, Norrington then joins Jack Sparrow's crew, where he gets the dead man's chest, which has Davy Jones' heart, and he gives that to Lord Cutler Beckett, and then Cutler Beckett makes him an admiral, and then he's back in the British Royal Navy. But throughout all of this, the one thing that he really wants is the love and attention of Elizabeth Swann, who he loses to Will Turner. Hubba hubba. And then finally, Norrington in the third movie, At World's End, decides to become good and prove himself as the gentleman pirate by sacrificing himself and giving Elizabeth and her crewmates time to escape the Flying Dutchman. So even though Norrington kind of switches between pirate and Navy man, he's ultimately a really great dude. No, he's not. He is, though, the definition of a gentleman pirate. Though throughout all three movies he didn't put manners first, his last sacrifice kind of redeems him in that area. Additionally, we don't know a lot about his education, but we can infer that he was pretty educated based on how high in the military ranks he had climbed. The man is also dead set on self-cultivation, making sure his needs are met, and self-improvement with his little redemption arc out of alcoholism there. So those are just a few examples of gentlemen pirates that I could think of, but I'm sure there's a lot more out there. There are a lot more out there. And it's really cool to me because they capture such an interesting part of history in England in the early 1700s. And they reflect on a bigger part of society and a bigger cultural narrative. Which, hey, that's pretty deep. But thank you guys so much for watching. Hit the like and subscribe button, and I'll see you next week with another hunk of junk video. Thank you.